I begin this week's lecture with a letter. Comic scholar Christopher Pizzino discovered this letter in the archives of the Library of Congress. The letter is from The Dagger, an otherwise anonymous comics fan, to Dr. Frederick Wortham. It reads, "You big bums, you're nuts. I hate you for saying that Dick Tracy is bad for us. You rotten slobs, you and your whole joint. Whoever let you out of the nut house must have been bats. The Dagger." From its threefold skull and crossbone motif, through its hand-drawn lineation, to its stylized signature, the Dagger resists authority. It resists good forms. It resists the psychiatrist, the doctor. Indeed, in writing and sending it, the Dagger probably resisted his parents as well. And so I see in it the call of a generation of readers, a generation who had had enough of the boss's rule, who wanted to read their comics regardless of the psychiatrist's conclusion, of the subcommittee's ruling, of their parents' worries about content, and of society's disregard for the comic book. And so I term this lecture The Death of the Father, or The Advent of the Graphic Novel. And my question is, what is the graphic novel? And why is it important? And more than that, what is its relationship to the comics of the past? In answering this question, I know full well that in our very first lecture, Mark Raxton told us already. Mark Raxton, in Ultimate Spider-Man 78, he said, "The thing is, do you know who Will Eisner was? You ever hear that name?" And then Mary Jane, she said, "No." But then Mark continued, and he became very passionate about it. He said he was like this famous comic book artist. In fact, the guy invented the comic book, the graphic novel. And what he did was he took something, the writing, an artwork, a comic strip, and he made it into a book. He put it together and he told a story with it. No one thought to do it before him. He was the first. He created something that prior to his creating it, it didn't exist. It's easy to dismiss Mark Raxton's statement. After all, he's a fictional high school senior in a comic book. But I would suggest that his claim that artistic innovation is revolutionary, that an individual artistic genius comes to a field and revolutionizes it alone and dynamically, that claim is persuasive. And I would suggest further that the claim that comic books are their own medium, that they too are individual and separate from the other arts and contain a revolutionary power, is similarly persuasive. And so I turn to Scott McCloud's great book, Understanding Comics. And here, on page 104, McCloud writes us a poem about the comics medium. It is a poem ultimately about the reader and the comic. He begins, "In comics, as in film, television, and real life, it is always now. This panel, and this panel alone, represents the present. Any panel before this, the last one for instance, represents the past. Likewise, all panels still to come, this next panel for instance, represent the future. But unlike other media, in comics, the past is more than just memories for the audience, and the future is more than just possibilities. Both past and future are real and visible and all around us. Wherever your eyes are focused, that's now. But at the same time, your eyes take in the surrounding landscape of past and future. Like a storm front, the eye moves over the comic's page, pushing the warm, high-pressure future ahead of it, leaving the cool, low-pressure past in its wake. Wherever the eye hits land, we expect it to begin moving forward. But eyes like storms, can change direction. MacLeod lays out a brilliant analysis. It opens in the first tier with a galaxy of clocks strangely floating. From there we turn to 3 measured panels in which MacLeod talks to us about the past, the present, and the future, and the rhythm of those panels is similar in their measured equality to the ticks of a clock. Indeed, each tick moves ahead, turning future into present and then into past, like the movement of the second hand on the clock. And the gutters that separate those panels are like the no man's land between the markers on a clock, in which the second hand sweeps across, marking a time without marking. MacLeod's opening is to suggest that reading bears some uncanny resemblance to time itself, and we can see that in that his eyes are circular like the clocks in the background. In the second tier, though, MacLeod dissolves this distinction, and so the panel falls away from him, and his hands, indeed, his whole body is open to that no man's land, that timeless time of the gutter. This, he says, is what makes comics unique. Both past and future are real and visible all around us. Then the third panel. The third panel introduces a powerful simile that at once advances and changes MacLeod's argument. The third panel, the third tier, first panel, opens with a panel of panels. In it is the eye. The eye here is both the reader's eye, but also, following a new simile, it is a hurricane's eye. It is the quietude in a larger spinning circle. And so MacLeod at the end of this tier reminds us that eyes like storms change direction. Storms move linearly, but they also arc back. And so we're brought back to those first clocks, and we realize that as much as they move linearly across time, stamping out second after second, devouring the future in the present and making it the past, they are also circular. And so reading, MacLeod suggests for comics, is both linear and recursive, both forward-moving and also charting a past in which we can turn back and read the other panels around us. MacLeod's notion of sequence here, sequence is moving forward, but also everywhere around us, is at the heart of his definition of comics, which he offers some pages earlier. MacLeod defines comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. And so, comics, MacLeod argues, have a unique relationship to both the page and to time. And I think we can say by extension, the graphic novel marks the medium's maturity. It has this same unique relationship to time, but it marks a growing up, a movement away from children's stories to more sophisticated stories. To this I would say, don't be fooled. The comics page is how all representational narrative art works. All narrative art drives linearly to its conclusion. All narrative art seeks finality. But it is the nature of art, embodied as it is in material forms. It is the nature of art to allow the reader to escape this linearity in at least 2 powerful ways. First, every form of art allows the reader to reflect on narrative story. Thus, witnessing a drama, we can return the following evening, study it again. Viewing a movie, we can pause it, rewind, study a scene. Reading a novel, we can reread the prose, or we can turn back 100 pages and see how it's developed. Looking at a painting, we can take in the whole painting, but then stop and study various moments, see how they interrelate. All art allows the reader to escape the inevitable narrative sequence and rewind it, recur on details, and deepen and enrich and reflect on his or her understanding. But more, all art also moves across time in a massive scope, and thus we can read art in the present, but we can also return to the past and read the art of the past. We can examine a story 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and we can enjoy it for what it says about its own time or for what it speaks to us now. All art allows us to escape sequence, allows us to recur like the eye of a hurricane on the past, on its own past, or on a global past. And so the comics page is in fact how all art works. And this brings us to a larger point. Art is not progressive. Individual geniuses do not break fundamentally from the past, for if they did, they would be unable to read that past. They would be unable to know what had been made before them, and they would invalidate that past. It is the fact that artists are within time, but they too can step out of time and speak to one another in that nether region between the ticks of clocks. So what I would argue is that the argument for medium is actually an argument about authority. It is an argument that says comics are their own medium when it means to say comics have the authority of all art. It is an argument that says the graphic novel is revolutionary when what it means to say is simply take comics seriously. And in this, I would say that the true power of recognizing comics is not merely to understand their marvelous stories, but that they teach us to think about all art. In this, I would like to turn now to Will Eisner in some depth, particularly to a lecture that he gave in 2002 at the University of Florida. I think that Will Eisner is a marvelous storyteller in prose or in comics, and that his lecture helps us understand the role of authority in art overall. Eisner tells us, and then something happened in 1969-71 in San Francisco. An underground movement began. A bunch of heads got together in San Francisco, Crumb, Spain, Spiegelman, and they began turning out some really remarkable comics. They were, I guess, insulting in a way, but they took on the establishment. At that time, I was a suit. I was running a publishing company up in Connecticut, and my secretary came in and she said, "Mr. Eisner, there's a man on the phone named Phil Suling who says he's got a comics convention down here in New York, and he wondered if you'd come down." Then she stopped and looked around the room to make sure no one else was around, and she said, "Were you ever a comic artist?" And I said, "Yes, I was a comic book cartoonist at one time." At any rate, I went down to the convention, which was being held in one of the hotels in New York, and there was a group of guys with long hair and scraggly beards who had been turning out what they spun as literature, really popular gutter literature, if you will, but pure literature. And they were taking on illegal subject matter that no comics had ever dealt with before. I talked to some of them, and there was a funny smell about them, cigarettes or perfume or something like that, and they laughed at the wrong times. At any rate, I came away from that, recognizing that a revolution had occurred then, a turning point in the history of this medium. I went back to Connecticut. This story is exciting on a number of different points, and I want to apply Cuskin rules 1, circle the details, and 2, synthesize those details, because I think if we do so, we can understand it at a deeper level. The first thing I circle is the notion of being a suit, and that reminds me of R. Crumb's comic Zap 1, where White Man is a suit. He's trying very hard to conform to an ideal of what a professional man is. And I see that, and I set it against something else. No one else around. It's a funny little scene. The secretary comes into the office. She knows no one's in there, but she's nervous to even say this. "Were you a comic artist?" Like it's a dirty word. So between being a suit and no one else around, I get a sense of social authority. Even when you're alone, you should be a suit. Because social authority is important, and being a comic artist is no authority at all. Then I move to the next paragraph, and I circle there long hair and scraggly beards. Those guys aren't wearing a suit at all. They're the underground comics guys. They're the movement of counterculture artists. More than that, Eisner says that they're spinning out literature, gutter literature, but it's also pure literature. So Eisner's saying on the one hand their subject matter isn't pure, it's dirty, it's guttery. But on the other hand, what they're talking about is pure literature, it's real art. And so Eisner thinks about that. And then he realizes that a revolution of new readers has come, and that the medium itself has changed. And so he sees a break from the codes of the past, both a break in the social codes. These long hairs who can smell funny, they can get together now. But also a break from the artistic codes. And so Eisner goes on to write A Contract with God, which he claims is the first graphic novel. However, the term graphic novel was first used years before, in 1964, by Richard Kyle. And in fact, graphic novels, novel-length comics, were around since Rudolf Topher's novels. In the United States, Franz Mazuril wrote A Passionate Journey, which was a book entirely of woodcut pictures, no words at all, but it told a real narrative. Lynn Ward wrote God's Man, a novel in woodcuts, which also had no words, and all this was before Superman, in the beginning of the 20th century. In Europe, Tintin had been serialized in newspapers, but also sold in books since the 1920s. By the 70s, Gil Kane and Archie Goodman had produced Black Mark, 1971, a full-length action-adventure in words and pictures that conformed entirely to the shape of the novel. Jim Steranko, soon after that, wrote Chandler, Red Tide, which was supposedly America's first graphic novel review. Don McGregor and Paul Galassi wrote Saber, which was a comic novel, and only in 1978 did Will Eisner's Contract with God come out. Really, only 4 years later, Marvel released The Death of Captain Marvel, which they termed a graphic novel. My point here isn't to undermine Will Eisner and his account of how he came to Contract with God. Indeed, Eisner is truly a genius. But his genius lies in his ability to tell stories and his ability to work the page in a unique and profound way. In fact, the graphic novel was developing over the course of the 20th century and developing hotly in the publishing techniques of the 1970s. So what I would suggest is that the strength of Eisner's story is about the nature of authority. The argument for medium is fundamentally about the authority we accord comics. On top of that, the graphic novel is essentially a marketing term to claim that authority, to present comic books as worthwhile. But we needn't use these terms because comics stand on their own.